Well, first of all, Karun, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Real pleased to be here.
It's honestly a pleasure to have you here. So we're going to open with quite a deep question. The foundry, the same incubator that built Apreo Health, actually built the original emphysema valve device all the way back in 2000. 25 years later, you guys are back working on the same disease. The foundry wrote publicly that they came back with a strong feeling there was unfinished business here. What was left unfinished, and why did it take a quarter of a century to go again?
Yeah, wow, that's a heavy question, Henry. You know, we at the foundry start companies where we're inspired by big unmet need. Inspiration was there 25, 30 years ago when we started Emphasys Medical. Had a concept that was really based on the objective of how do we achieve a lung volume reduction that is less invasive than surgery. These are patients who have incredibly debilitating shortness of breath. Best way to appreciate this is if you were to take a deep breath in right now and before exhaling, take a second breath right after that first breath. That second breath is the only breath that these patients have. It's incredibly shallow. We call that dyspnea, shortness of breath. And because they have such little breath, there's only so much that they're able to do. They can barely walk themselves to the other side of the room, dress themselves, play with their grandkids, no way. And historically, the only way to solve that or address that was to go in and actually cut out pieces of lung tissue to free up room in the chest cavity. Pretty barbaric. And so my partners at the foundry way back said, God, there's gotta be a better way to achieve this outcome without it being this incredibly invasive surgery. So that was the question, and Emphasys Medical was the answer with the Zephyr valve. Raised a lot of money, ran multiple studies, including a randomized control study, and the study outcome was not what was intended. And so the investors ended up selling the assets to a company called Pulmonx. Pulmonx ran with it. To their credit, they ran another study. It was a successful study. They got it approved. But as we've seen the market develop in patients with emphysema, that product and approach has had very narrow applicability. It just doesn't work in everybody. So they're developing a market, but can only penetrate a small percentage of that market. So that's where we're like unfinished business. There's a lot of people that still need help. Let's see if we can develop something that is unique, that addresses the majority of patients who have severe emphysema.
So when did this business come back on the table? Where did it come back into the foundry?
Yeah, so can't talk about Apreo without mentioning Dr. Marty Mays. Marty is a prolific physician inventor. He's a tremendous entrepreneur. He's actually an interventional pulmonologist who has an engineering background, who then became an entrepreneur because he realized I can actually help a lot more people if I develop the product of my curiosity versus treating patients one at a time. So very unique individual, and he's always asking questions like, why do we have this problem? And is there a better way to solve the problem? And I think when we look at the foundry in our playbook, it's really focused on developing an intimate understanding of the problem, because you can't solve the problem without really understanding what it is. And that's Marty as well. I mean, he's been a longtime collaborator with us because he has that same level of curiosity. One of the challenges that we have in our, I'd say, medtech ecosystem is much of the development we do, engineering we do, is kind of linear. It's like, okay, here's the standard of care. How can we improve upon that? But sometimes you got to take a big step back to take more steps forward. And this opportunity in Apreo is, I think, the quintessential example of that philosophy, because all the stuff that had been done before was actually taking us in the wrong direction. And Marty's owed a lot of credit because he shined a light on that and intrigued us. Like the first time he brought this idea to our attention was like back in like 2016, 2017. And at the time, no product had yet been approved by FDA. So even though we started Emphasys Medical, back in 2000, that Zephyr valve had not been approved yet. It took until 2018 for that to get approved. And then Pulmonx went public in 2020 during COVID, and the market responded, and their market cap skyrocketed. I mean, it went to nearly $3 billion. So between 2018 and 2020, we said, okay, wait a second, there may be an opportunity to finance a company in the COPD emphysema space. But when Marty first brought the idea to us, we're just like, we're not sure if anything has changed since we sacked Emphasys. So timing is really everything.
Okay. So what did you see in the timing piece that made you think Apreo is ready to go?
Well, so I think a couple of things. One, back to this idea, you have to understand the problem. And to understand the problem, you have to be asking the right questions. And with a ton of credit to my partners at the Foundry that started Emphasys, they were really asking the wrong question. They asked, how can we achieve the same effect of a surgical lung volume reduction that's less invasive? And they asked that question, they answered it well, in that they developed a valve that would go in and through natural orifice, drop in a valve that shut down a big portion of the lung. So they were able to non-surgically reduce the lung by sacrificing a lobe. So they answered the question, they answered it beautifully, very thoughtfully, but that was the wrong question, because what happens here is with a valve procedure, or even some of the other approaches to lung volume reduction that followed valves, it's destructive. You're actually sacrificing, people say, hey, we're treating a lung with, or a lobe of the lung with valves. You're not treating that lobe. You're sacrificing the lobe for the betterment of the rest of the lung. But you have a pair of lungs here that are incredibly diseased, and sacrificing any bit of it doesn't make a lot of sense. You're actually going to war with an organ that you're looking to help. So the question that we asked ourselves coming back to this from a scientific and clinical standpoint is there a way for us to treat the lung that's collaborative? That was the question. And Marty answered that question with his concept, and we said, okay, this is something that we have to go deeper on to better understand if this has legs.
So let's actually understand the disease state first. What's actually going on in the lungs that they need to be treated in the first place?
Yeah, so we talk about COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's an umbrella term that covers several different pathophysiologies or phenotypes. One is bronchitis, very common. That's like mucus production that blocks the airways. That's not what we're focused on. We're focused on a different phenotype called severe emphysema. Emphysema is a chronic progressive disease that's associated with many years of inhaling polluted air. That could be through smoking, firsthand, secondhand smoking, being in an industrial area where you are inhaling, again, highly polluted air. Over time, the air the polluted air that you're inhaling has particles that are toxic. You inhale them, they embed themselves in the lung tissue. And once you have a large enough dose of that toxic load, it triggers an inflammatory process in your lungs that starts killing off your functional lung tissue. And so many people with very severe disease have lost 30, 40% of their functional lung, which means that in theory, 60 to 70% of their lung is intact. So a lot of people think, oh, you're losing all that functional lung and that's the problem. That's actually not the problem. The problem is when you lose that functional lung, you have this diseased tissue that hyperinflates. It takes in air and then it grows. It's like this balloon that keeps growing and growing. And that 30 to 40% of the diseased tissue now is like 2 to 3 times its size. The chest cavity is fixed volume. So when you have the disease portion that's 2 to 3 times its size, it is literally bullying the healthy tissue, so the healthy tissue can't ventilate. You can't take in fresh air. So that's why you have that shortness of breath, is because you're taking in a breath, but you don't have any room to ventilate. So our goal with Apreo is to resolve that state of hyperinflation, which is entirely due to what we call air trapping. Air gets in, it can't get out. So we've developed a product that goes in a very minimally invasive way, in a collaborative way, lets air out of the balloon, enables you to exhale fully, which then means that you can breathe in, inhale fully, and properly ventilate the healthy parts of the lung that haven't been getting air properly.
Wow. And that seems like when you put it like that, it seems like the most logical part of the solution. Instead of shutting down bits which are, I guess, not letting air out, it's, well, if you can create the airway to actually allow that oxygen to escape or the CO2 to escape, sounds like the most logical solution when you put it like that.
Well, when you wipe the slate clean, yeah, and one of our investors the other day, he said, this is an elegantly simple solution for an incredibly complex disease. And I think that was so well put, because sometimes that's what you have to do to combat the complexity, the debilitating nature of the disease. You got to go back to square one and keep it simple. But what happened, and we started this at the Foundry, is we went off in a direction and said, God, these patients are incredibly sick. They're desperate. We have to do something. And that started with surgical intervention. It's like, okay, these patients are desperately ill. We got to do something. Let's put them through surgery. But it started us in a direction that got us more and more off course, because it wasn't just valves. After valves came endobronchial coils, and then vapor and glue. And every one of those modalities, although the modality was different, the end goal was the same. It was destructive to the lung, which is not good for these patients who are already very sick.
No, I completely get that. And so we're going to come back to Apreo Health further into the conversation, talk more about the business and where it's got to. But we've got to learn about you and your background first, because I think it's so interesting where you actually started. So tell us, where did you study, what did you study, and what was the journey from there?
Sure. So I have a mechanical engineering background. I'm from the Midwest, Michigan, automotive country. Have a lot of family history in automotive. And so, kind of through the program that I was in, we were kind of hardwired to follow a path in the auto industry. And so I studied, saw a lot of opportunity, especially back in the 90s when I graduated from college, in the auto industry. But as I got deeper into understanding what that was, I started to realize that's not me. That's not of interest at all. I must be not a very good engineer if this doesn't get me excited. And so I came out of, I'd say, a really great educational experience with a lot of uncertainty and self-doubt. Said, okay, maybe I got to do something different here. I did feel like there were parts of my experience or skills, abilities that hadn't been exercised yet. And I wanted to go and develop those. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do something really different, provocative, and go into entirely different education. Not profession necessarily, because I didn't really have any particular profession in mind, but I said, I want to try something I've never done before. And I said, I'm going to go to law school. Again, pretty provocative, because there are a lot of engineers, including my dad, who was like, lawyers create problems, engineers solve problems. Why do you want to create problems? And I didn't take the bait. I just said, you know what? I want to learn how to think. I want to learn how to develop a high degree of comprehension and strengthen my communication skills, my interpersonal skills. And law school did that. 3 years of that was pretty intense. I'd say added a number of aptitudes, to my tool belt. And in that process, became very well versed in intellectual property law. What is that? It's identifying really what is critically and competitively valuable about an innovation, and making sure that that's protected and proprietary to whoever owns it, who's looking to exploit it. And around that time was the .com bubble, let's say, that was forming in California. And so there was a huge need for patent attorneys. And I didn't really know, again, if I wanted to practice law per se, but there was a huge opportunity in this profession. They paid really well, and it gave me access to this new economy in California. So I said, hey, I'm going to go and give it a shot, see what happens. And when I landed in California, I found myself working with a lot of medtech clients, physician inventors that had a great concept that needed to lay the foundational building blocks for the company, venture capital funded startups, and then even larger companies. But what I found was intellectual property in the medtech space was incredibly valuable. You had lots of capital going in to protect a concept. It would take many years of effort, investment, uncertainty before you knew if this was going to play out. If you succeeded and you actually showed that this is the new standard of care, everybody's going to come in behind you and want to accelerate their development based on what you've proven. And that is a recipe for the importance and criticality of intellectual property protection. So I realized I was working in a space that was hugely valuable, big impact in terms of life-saving innovation, and the role of IP was as important to that as anything. So very different than my experience in automotive, I saw, really the stars align and say, here are things that make this aptitude important in value creation, and it aligns really well with my interests in technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and being incredibly strategic. So I find myself having a really good time, but not as good a time as I really thought I should have.
Do you mind if I jump in there before we dive into the next part? So that intellectual property side is super interesting, and there's probably tons of listeners out there who are thinking maybe they have an idea, maybe it's a forward-thinking physician who wants to learn about entrepreneurship. What do companies need to get right when they're building out their IP in the early stages, and where do you see it occasionally go wrong for those people if they don't get it right in the first stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is the foundational building block, so you can never invest too much in your IP, which I know is when you're a bootstrapped startup, you have very limited resources, but this is one that if you don't do it well, do it right at the beginning, you will have regret. I've seen it countless times. And so the first thing is make sure that you're documenting your innovation. You go very, very deep initially and make sure you're describing every manifestation, embodiment of that idea and get it filed. We're in a first to file regime, meaning whoever describes the invention in a patent application, who has the earliest filing date, owns that. And if you're inspired to do something, odds are somebody else is inspired to do the same thing. And I've seen this many times in my career where there's been an unknowing race to the patent office. I say unknowing is because you have multiple parties that are both doing the same thing, and they're not aware of each other. And sometimes one party will beat another by a matter of days. And that could be the difference between, do you own the critical seminal IP in this big market? So start early, invest heavily, go deep, but I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here. You have to go broad as well, because IP is about, it's option theory. With a patent application, you're basically claiming an option on this idea or concept, but you're not going to know if that particular concept holds water until you get to a later stage of risk retirement. Especially in medtech, you got to do technical bench level development. Then you can get into, tissue-based experiments like animal, cadaver experiments, and those take time, those take capital. And then ultimately you get to where the rubber hits the road, and that's a clinical study. Years can go by from the point you have the initial idea until you get the right level of clinical validation. Well, what secures your interest in that idea? It's your intellectual property. So you got to file on that idea, but then you don't know if it's going to be first variant of that idea or variant B, C, or D, or it could be an entirely different approach. And so you want to make sure that you conceive and document every variant of that so that even if the one that you today think is the most promising, you get down the way with that and you realize, oh, wait a second, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You can backtrack and then pursue a different approach and still have priority to that invention. So it's really important to take your time, think about, here's the core concept, make sure that's well documented, and then go broad and say, okay, here are all the different manifestations of that, and make sure you've secured it, because we always use that expression, publish or perish. What does that mean? In the field of medicine, to get adoption, to get buy-in from the clinical community, you have to publish, you have to present, you have to share your discoveries with the rest of the world. That's called thought leadership. It's really important to advance medicine. You're educating the world. Well, the deal is if you're going to share your ideas with the world, you need to get something back in return. And that's the whole basis of our patent system. So this is where I think medtech innovation and intellectual property rights go hand in hand.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
And what about international patent protection? So, I mean, you may have been covering it through that conversation, but like, where should you be focusing if you're a startup? Should you be trying to get every jurisdiction you possibly can? Should you focus on the US to make sure the biggest healthcare market is dominated first? Because obviously, you said bootstrapped, it's expensive. What do you think on that topic?
Yeah, finite resources, have to make sure you're deploying them thoughtfully, responsibly. I think you said it, Henry, start with the markets. Look at your particular innovation. What are the big markets? And grab those. And so again, it's options, right? And the way intellectual property works is you file an application, at some point it goes into examination. In medtech, it's not terribly complicated when you look at the big markets. It's US, Europe, I'd say our first tier. Like, I don't think that's a matter of question. If you have very limited resources, I think those are the markets you absolutely want to file in. Europe is a little complicated because you get a European patent, then you have to validate it in each country, and each country has its own costs, and then you have to enforce it in those countries. So it's a little tricky, but I think the markets are robust enough that you want to have it there. It's also, again, back to the theme of IP is about options. So you want to secure exclusivity to that product or innovation in product in those markets. So you don't necessarily have to decide today if you want to commercialize in those markets, but if you file in those territories, then at least you've given yourself the option. So US, Europe, China, we've been saying for years, is this immense market opportunity. We all want to have the option of going into China. So I think you add China to the mix. Japan has always been a big market. They set very high regulatory bar. And as a result, usually you get pretty high ASPs for your product, high margins, right? So if you're going to get high margins, that's going to attract a lot of competition. You want to have intellectual property. So you can kind of see the cascade here: US, Europe, China, Japan. I usually add Australia to that list. I wouldn't say it's a huge market, but the practice of medicine is similar. It's usually a place where a lot of companies go to do the first early round of clinical research. So in good practice, I mean, there are other places you could go. South America, for example, in certain markets like aesthetics is huge. And I haven't seen too many occasions where IP has been successfully enforced, but sometimes it could be a deterrent to entry, and so having a patent there. So I think you have to exercise a little bit of discretion, but the handful of countries that I mentioned, I think investors, acquirers, all expect that you would have rights in those markets.
Okay, awesome. And thanks for going into some details there. So going to go back into the story. So you're helping all these medtech companies out with their IP. Tell me where it goes from there.
Yeah, I mean, I found their stories, experiences to be really inspiring. The goal of having impact in a way that can globally kind of improve the standard of care was super cool. If you're successful, you can make a lot of money for your investors yourself. So all of that resonated. But really what resonated most was the immediate local impact you could have. You innovate something. I mean, we've all been, in a place where because of injury or disease, our backs are up against the wall. At an individual level or personally with a family member, we've been humbled by disease, helpless by disease, hopeless by disease even. And to be part of developing and innovating something that actually creates options that helps us, in some cases, better manage, in other cases, defeat disease, is incredibly inspiring and empowering. And so when I started to see some of my clients or business partners having that, I'm like, I want to do that. I don't want to be your lawyer. I want to be you. I want to be a partner with you. And that was an important discovery for me, because I think coming out of a community of lawyers, there's a lot of risk aversion. Really good at identifying issues and risks, which sometimes means that we don't have appetite for risk. But I was kind of the opposite there. I was like, wow, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the risks, but I also want to factor in the upside and have some skin in the game. And for me, the skin in the game was, career progression, doing things of greater importance and having more responsibility, the financial reward and recognition that goes with that, and then the personal gratification of doing something that at a very personal human level has high impact. All of those boxes were checked. And for me, it was a pretty easy decision. Actually said one point early in my career, I'm moving to the Silicon Valley and I want to be a medtech entrepreneur.
Okay. So how did that journey into entrepreneurship start?
Started at the Foundry. So at the Foundry, I found a group of folks that were inspired, really motivated to develop, as I said earlier, a very intimate understanding of a clinical problem, big problem, and then come up with, in many cases, a provocative solution. I say provocative because it usually challenges something that we assume is well known or established about the disease or about the treatment methodology, and say, you know what, we're going to challenge all those assumptions and start over, wipe the slate clean, blank canvas. And that's where intellectual property actually gets really important. So when I got connected to the Foundry, they had a great need for strong intellectual property support, and I had a great need to be in an environment where I could do more than just be the IP guy. So it was an incredibly symbiotic and frankly synergistic set of circumstances where I came in and did a lot of the patent work, helped support multiple portfolio companies. One of those was Ardian. We can go into that in more detail later. But then also helped sit on the founding team of a number of companies where we had no idea where we were going to go. We were in incubation mode, but we had to start dropping stakes in the ground, and every idea we had, make sure it's well documented so that we secure those options for ourselves as we start to go deeper down a path.
So let's dive into the Foundry. So some people might know, but some people might not know. What really is the Foundry, and what value does it give to the startups and ideas that it has?
We call ourselves an incubator. Sometimes when we say that, it evokes this idea of, we're this facility of operators. We invite entrepreneurs to come in and take residence. And there's a little bit of that, but I would say venture studio is probably a more descriptive term, in that we are maniacally focused, pathologically focused on doing something really disruptive to dramatically improve the standard of care. And when we see an idea that has legs, we want to throw ourselves into it, get passionate about it. Because of the relationships we have, and I'd say track record, we have the ability to secure funding. So some of the things that may be an obstacle for other entrepreneurs, I think we've been able to work that out in our model, particularly on the financing and the strategic relationship side. If we're really interested in something, odds are we can find an investment or strategic partner that could also get interested. So for us, it's really about identifying a problem that we're very excited about and then putting all of our resources and energy behind that. So I've used the term serial entrepreneur. So we do this in series. We're not coming up with 10 ideas at once or going after 10 problems at once. We will look at a handful of problems in parallel with the objective of finding one to have that maniacal focus on, and then start a company from. So we'll take 6 to 12 months where we'll look at a bunch of unmet needs. We'll see who's on the forefront of innovation, thought leadership. With them, develop an intimate familiarity of the problem, and then come up with our own theory as to where this problem was coming from. What's the etiology? And from that, brainstorm solutions. And if we feel like there's something there that is not only good science, but good business. We have a tagline, transforming concepts into companies. Meaning that even if you have a good idea that is valid from a scientific standpoint, there still has to be a way to have a successful business here. Because no matter how altruistic your ambition might be, and we have a lot of that, I mean, we want to have impact at a very personal human level, you still have to secure capital. This is super capital intensive. So we have to be able to transform this into a successful business. So in our DNA is the ability to develop that vision so that it's not just about a great idea, securing the intellectual property to protect it and then doing the evidence development and generation, but it's laying out that roadmap to what could make this a very successful company.
Incredible stuff. And so you obviously had that moment where you became maniacally focused, which I love that term, by the way, maniacally focused on Apreo Health, and that's when you decided to take it on as yours. So what was the moment where it flipped from this is a great idea, could be altruistic, but actually this is a business and we take it forward from here?
June 13th, 2021. That's the date. Marty, myself, one of our other partners at the Foundry, we were in a lab in Minnesota playing around with human cadaver lungs. 2021 was an interesting time, right? We were still kind of in the shadow of COVID. Playing around with human tissue, lung tissue, diseased lung tissue was a big no-no. Many of us were based in California. Why were we in Minneapolis? It was like, you cannot do this in California. There was no lab that would let you go and do this. Minnesota, they were a little bit more open-minded about this sort of thing. So Marty and I dressed up, head to toe in PPE. We ran some experiments in these human lungs to test his concept, his theory, and say, if you had a diseased lung, could you localize those areas of air trapping? We actually found a bench model that would allow us to take a human lung, hook it up to airflow, put it in a chamber where we controlled pressure, and then ventilate it. And then based on the settings of the airflow, we could actually simulate a respiration cycle. So we had these human lungs ex vivo that we were putting through a respiration cycle, and we could see different levels of pulmonary function. Not just see, but we could quantify it. So this was a great bench model for assessing pulmonary function, which also enabled us to test different approaches. So on that date, we actually ran some experiments and said, oh, wait a second, there might be a way to solve this mechanistically. And Marty already had the concept laid out very nicely. But this was a test in human tissue that confirmed that result. And so that day we ran some experiments and said, okay, we got something here. This is where we're going to stay focused and start a company.
Wow, that's so cool. And so you pulled all of this together, and right now, tell us a bit about the situation. What's the company doing right now? Tell us about the financing up to this point. Just give us a bit of an idea of how this has all come together.
Yeah, as of today, we're in the throes of an IDE pivotal study, big randomized control study, great alignment with FDA. Most of our sites are in the US, but we have a handful of sites in Europe as well. And it's about 200 patients in this study. So this is the big one, where the evidence from this is going to really communicate a value proposition: safety, efficacy, durability of effect, and the ability to treat the wide margin of patients with severe emphysema. So this is our big pivotal registration study that will be part of our PMA application. We closed the financing in August of 25, a huge number, $130 million. We hadn't actually intended to raise that kind of money, but we went to the market, found an incredible, robust interest in supporting the company, not just through the randomized control study, not just through a successful PMA application and approval, but into commercialization. So that's really what that financing is intended to do, is get us through a market launch and demonstrate clinical adoption to take this particular therapy and lay it down as the backbone of a standalone respiratory company.
Awesome. And the cap table is also incredibly impressive as well. It's not just a big number, it's from some really big name investors, Bain, Sante, a couple of others that off the top of my head can't remember. But it's a really cool cap table as well. What is it that they saw where because doing it before a big pivotal trial, there's a lot of people who would say, let's put a little bit in now and let's see how the pivotal trial goes. So what is it that really got them to take it through and give you the money for commercialization too?
Yeah, that's a very good and loaded question, Henry. So I would say the overwhelming majority of investors saw the immense potential because of our early clinical data. From 2023 to 25, we did our feasibility study, generated really compelling data that suggested that this could be the big breakthrough, going back 25, 30 years now. And I had over 40 investors that were impressed by that data, so impressed that they wanted to go into diligence under NDA, get into our data room. But the overwhelming majority said, we definitely want to invest, but we want to invest in the commercial round, not in the clinical round. So ring us back when you're ready to raise the commercial round. And so that was added a lot of time to the fundraising process, because we had many that said no for now. And I'm like, well, we need now. We're not interested in later. We need to get the study financed. And there was a lot of anxiety because endobronchial valves had great potential. At one point when they went public, our market cap, as I said, was nearly $3 billion. And now it's nowhere near that. And that's because of an inability to really penetrate that market. And so I told those investors, that is not the reason to pass on this opportunity. That is actually the reason to take this opportunity. And a super minority of folks agreed. But thankfully, it was this exceptional syndicate. So Norwest, Bain as co-leads, Lightstone and Sante as the Series A investors doubling down. I mean, lots of credit and respect to them because they came in early. They continued to support us. And then we added a few other new investors, F Prime, OSF Healthcare, which is a strategic hospital system investor, and then Intuitive Ventures. Intuitive Surgical is a strategic here where they've made heavy investments in robots that are designed to go into the lung. And so here's a treatment that potentially could be quite synergistic with that.
That's super interesting, to be fair. So what are you most excited for about what comes next? And I'm sure we can guess the answer, but tell me more.
Well, I think we are at the place where the rubber does hit the road with the Apreo treatment. It's still early in the sense. The immediate next steps over the next couple of years are execute well in the study, generate great clinical outcomes. What we have right now is about 20 years of innovation, very expensive innovation, hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into some of those predecessor treatments that have not gotten us there. And so there is a great deal of skepticism. We need to stay focused on executing, overcoming the skeptics, and breaking through. And what I'm really excited about, Henry, is there is massive unmet need in the respiratory field, not just in emphysema, but in COPD broadly, and then even broadly in lung health. Think about lung cancer. There's been a lot of investment in lung cancer, again, not as much success. And so I'd love for us at Apreo to be the vehicle that delivers innovation to the respiratory and pulmonary community. So there's a lot to be gained here. And you think about recent examples of that in other domains. Inari did it in the veins, right? Penumbra has done it in neurovascular. So you can build an entire market through successful, thoughtful, focused, methodical execution. And so that's where we are. We're not going to take the opportunity for granted. We have access to the funding. That is one of the trickiest parts, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. Now we just have to stay focused, get it done, and I think there'll be some immense opportunities that come from that.
Okay. And so you've come on this journey from mechanical engineer, patent lawyer, into the world of entrepreneurship. What's most surprised you about that journey, taking on a CEO role, and what was it that's been most surprising about this journey to you?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think, the importance of people. In all of these disciplines, you focus in on, in many respects, the science, the engineering. I mean, I spend probably much of my time reading papers and getting into clinical literature and, again, developing a very intimate understanding of the disease. But at the end of the day, it's people that drives everything. We're actually solving a big problem to help people. And our mission at Apreo, as an example, is, we have people that are getting wheeled in. They're on oxygen. They're getting wheeled into the room. They can't even walk well by themselves. And afterwards, they're climbing stairs, and the impact that has, not just on the patient, but everybody around them, is really transformative in so many respects. So it's the people that we impact, but then the people that it takes to get it done. It does take a village. It's so incredibly cross-functional, multidisciplinary. So you got to bring everybody along, making sure that we're all working together. There isn't one person that's more important. It's hard. Like in medtech, we assign a lot of value to like the clinical operator, right? Like the medical guy in the company. But the reality is there are so many things about the practice of medicine that are flawed and misinformed. If they weren't, we wouldn't even be here. We wouldn't have jobs. And I think we have to embrace that. And so for me, it's really important that when we get our whole team sitting around the table, everybody has to contribute. If you have something to say, you have to say it, because we bring our passion, our common sense, our ability to be self-critical to the discussion. And that's what gets things done. That's how we solve problems. And so that's probably, back to your question, that's the thing that surprised me the most is I don't think we give enough attention to that in any of these disciplines. But I found at the end of the day that's what's key. And if you find the right people, you build that team, and you lead the team effectively, that's going to translate into great value creation.
For sure, and I love that. So the final thing to bring it onto in this conversation, I've really enjoyed today as well, is what's the one thing you want the world to know about Apreo and what comes from this company?
Back to, I guess just the last part of the conversation. Apreo is about people. We have a set of core values that we wrote as a team. Actually went through a very, very elaborate process where we had every member of the team contributing their thoughts as to what individual values do I have? How do I want people to look at me, look at this company? And we took all of that data, we synthesized it, and we drafted a list of core values, and people are part of it. It's a big, big part of it. And I think that's one of the things that makes us actually very unique, because many medical device companies will talk in terms of patients. And 100%, like, patients are so important. They're why we're here, but we have deliberately broadened that out to the people, because it's not just about the patients. Frankly, we are so inspired every day by the doctors that have been humbled by the disease, powerless because they see their patients suffering, and they see us as a partner that can help give them the tools to do right by their patients. And so we're so motivated to help not just the patients, but the doctors that are treating the patients. And then when we look around the table to each other, and we want to support our team members, we want them to be successful in their careers. And so when we said, how do we capture all of that? People is the word. We're in this business to help people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Karun.
Sure, my pleasure, Henry. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those 3 things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.